about how his wife waited for him, not knowing whether he was alive or dead, and dealt with it in her own unique way. So the book is also about how the hero, T.P. Kumaran Nair, finds his own Swaraj, or his own self-rule of a very different kind.
One thing that struck me the most while reading the book is the immense amount of research you have done. See, I'll read a small passage, okay? So this is about Burmese women singing and dancing. Several women wearing lonkis and loose blouses sang as they gracefully lifted one balab sack at a time from a pile strewn on the river bank. They kept time with the lilting song as they placed the sacks on the bare backs of stooped men standing in line. The men then ran to a boat, climbed makeshift ramps made of planks, tossed the sacks into the vessel, and raced back for their next load. The women repeated a chorus several times. Sain win he, Mia win he. So, if this when you read it, it feels like you are reading a travelogue of a 2022 person going to Burma. But it's not. This whole book is set in the 1930s. So if you want to talk about war documents, yes, you can do archival research. These British documents or Japanese documents are accessible, at least up to a limit. You get access to these documents. But about the geography, about culture, about people, that's a whole different kind of research. So as a research scholar myself, I was so impressed with the kind of research you have done for this book. And I really would like you to talk about this to our audience.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for those kind words coming from a scholar. That's good to hear. So the seeds of this book were planted in my brain by my father, my late father, as I was growing up. He would tell me little bits and stories about this man. And those stories stayed in my head. And then on one day, I just had an epiphany, a sudden realization, 13 years ago to be exact, that, my God, this is a story that needs to be told. And I said, great. So I started looking around. There was nothing. The trail had not only gone cold, it was frozen. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is, even within the INA that I talk about, if I were to ask most of you that haven't read the book to name the first leader of the INA, what would you say? You would say Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and you'd be wrong. Because there was another INA before it, run by a man called Captain Mohan Singh. And that one failed because of tension between the Japanese and the Indians. But the reason I bring that up is, there was very little about the INA. There's a lot about the Subhash Bose INA, but very little. So what did I do? I got a lot of information from family, including letters that he wrote and so on, about what happened to him before he went to Malaya. But in terms of what happened in Malaya, I traveled. I live in the US, but I traveled to different parts of the world, looked at documents. The one good thing about the British is they wrote everything down. So, and also to get a visual reference of the places I was going to write about. But you know what? Here's the interesting thing. If I go to Singapore of today, it won't help me, because today's Singapore is not the Singapore of the 1930s. So I spent hours looking at YouTube videos to understand, what did Singapore look like then? What did it sound like before and after the bombs fell? And slowly, I started getting an image of what that might have been. And for places that I couldn't travel to, Burma, for example, it was too dangerous. I used Google Earth to kind of sit in my study in Atlanta, USA, and take a look at what was going on. That particular scene that you talked about, I have a good friend of mine who is Anglo-Burmese. And I was telling him about this story, and he told me about this song. And that's where it came from. So the research came from many different sources, and slowly the story started emerging out of the mist. And the real story, Arundhati, was way more interesting and more fascinating than the bits and pieces my dad told me. So what I tried to do was to write a book which is pretty close to the facts. It's about 80% factual, and to use narrative writing as a way to convey the facts.
So it all started with your father telling you the stories
Yeah.
about your granduncle.
Yeah.
So how did you find these letters? Your father gave them to you?
No. There's a part about the book, in the book, without giving the book away, where he got letters smuggled out through the help of someone. And those letters, and the reason why he had to smuggle the letters was because if he sent the letters through regular channels, they'd be censored by the British. So these smuggled letters were all collected by his brother, his older brother, who kept them. And years later, I was able to get copies of those letters. And those are incredible letters, and they're written in perfect English. The man only studied up to intermediate, but that generation was different. He wrote in beautiful language. And you know, Arundhati, it's interesting. This is a man who knew he was in trouble. But there's no self-pity, no anger, only compassion for other people. So that's how come I got the letters, yeah.
How many of these letters are there?
About 15.
15.
1-5.
1-5. And all of these are written in English or in Malayalam?
There are some in Malayalam. And I can read a little bit of Malayalam, but I got my mother to translate them to me so that I wouldn't make any mistakes. But most of them were in English because he wrote it to his brother. And again, that generation was different. They communicated with each other, and it's kind of Victorian almost, the whole letter writing being an art and so on. And it was fascinating to discover all of that. Yeah.
So this book is based on true events. The hero of this book is real.
Right.
Then why didn't you write this book as a book of non-fiction, you know? As a student of social science, I would have loved it to read it as a history book. But you chose the genre of historical fiction. Why that choice?
That's a great question, and I'll tell you why I did that. Because it all starts with, when you write a book, you have to decide whom are you writing the book for. So I chose to write not for a scholar and not even for a history buff. I wrote the book for people who like good writing in English and good storytelling. So having chosen that path, the burden becomes a little more difficult, because how do you communicate history in a way which people will understand? And I think, I'll be honest, I think school systems, not just in India, but the world over, have done a disservice in the way they teach history. They make it dry and boring, and if you ask most students and you say history, they'll say, oh my God, you know, in 1526, Babur and Lodi fought the Battle of Panipat, blah, blah, blah. So what I've tried to do is to get away from that. So what did I do? I chose two avenues. One is I chose an evocative style of writing where I've tried to take my readers to where the characters are, to have them see and hear, and especially smell. Smell is a strong emotion, what the characters are going through. Second, I also chose to write not about the big events of war and strategy and politics. I chose to write about how these events affect ordinary people, both the people in the zone as well as their loved ones waiting for them. And the reason why I did this is to communicate the history without taxing the reader. And in fact, a reader called me and said, you know, it's only after I finished the book I realized that I'd learned a lot of history without realizing that was what was going on. And that was exactly the objective. So that's why I chose that genre. It gave me a little bit of elbow room for the audience that I had identified. And you know, you might say, well, who cares? I mean, the vast majority of India's population is under the age of 30, and the independence movement and INA was so long ago. I'll tell you a little story. As part of the research to identify how these letters got smuggled out, my cousin and I went to Madras, now Chennai, to a house to identify the house through which these letters got smuggled. So we landed up there on a street in Vapuri, knocked on the first door, and this lady showed up. She must have been in her 30s. She had a chattagam in one hand and manjal, turmeric on her face. And he said, "Enna venum?" And so I speak Tamil, so I told her kind of the story. And she thought about it and she said, "Appadiya, ungalai kandipa udhive seyanam. I definitely have to help you." You won't believe it. She spent 3 hours, abandoned the work she had to do at home, took us from house to house to house to house, and every one of those people's welcomed two complete strangers into their home, gave us coffee, sent their little kids running around trying to find out, in this house, that person. In the end, we couldn't trace the house because the numbering system had changed. But the reason I'm telling you this is this. You may think that the younger generation in India don't care about what happened. I disagree. This woman was so passionate about what had happened to help two strangers and take 3 hours out of her day to help us. And that's the reason I chose the path that I did, saying if she was so interested, then I need to write a book that can be read by many people like her.
But there is an issue, right, in telling the story as a story and not as fact. So people might question some of the narratives. Maybe this is exaggerated. Maybe since this person was his grand uncle, he wanted to portray him as a hero. So that's there. And so did you ever think of it? Maybe a fiction is not the way to.
No, I didn't. Arundhati, you're right. There is that risk that people might think, oh, he wants to write about
He
his
wants to
grand uncle.
glorify, his family.
That's right. That's the risk I had to take, because at the end of the day, to me, history is his story, her story, and their story. And as I said, even though you might have a few people discounted saying, no, I mean, this is not factual, that's not my audience. The audience is, if it's the 80-20 rule, if 80% of the people like the book, like the story, and after the last page is turned, they remember this tale, and then when they drive by T.P. Kumaran Nair Road, they say, aa pusthakathinte theme. That is good enough for me. The scholar might point a finger and say, it's not this, it's not that, but that's not my audience.
Okay. So this is at Nellikode, right? The T.P. Kumaran Nair Road. Nellikode.
Correct.
Nellikode, right?
Yeah.
അടുത്ത തവണ നിങ്ങൾ ആരെങ്കിലും നെല്ലിക്കോട് വഴി പോകുമ്പോൾ ടി.പി. കുമാരൻ നായർ റോഡ് എന്നൊരു ബോർഡ് കാണുകയാണെങ്കിൽ അത് ഈ സ്വരാജ് സ്പൈ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന പുസ്തകത്തിൻ്റെ നായകനാണ്. ഇങ്ങനെ എത്രയോ പേര് നമ്മൾ കണ്ടിട്ട് ആരാണെന്ന് അറിയാതെ പോകുന്നു. അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ഒരു അൺസങ് ഹീറോയുടെ കഥയാണ്. ബട്ട് നോട്ട് ജസ്റ്റ് ദാറ്റ് ദ ബുക്ക് when I think this can be categorized into 2 or 3 parts of this book. And the first part, it looked like a personal journey. Okay, there is this young man, passionate, and he wants India to be free. He wants to do something about this rule. How Indian people are subjugated, treated as savages, and then when he moves to Singapore, the story also goes to another level, a different scale. It becomes grand with so many actors coming into play. The Japanese, the British, the Americans, and so many countries are involved, from Singapore to Malaya to Burma. So something begun as a personal journey then becomes a quiet political journey. How did you, it was a deliberate, this shift, that the story should not be about one man. This should be a grander narrative.
Okay, that's actually a very perceptive question, because my book is layered. And I tell people that the book is about the intersection of 3 journeys. One is the physical journey of this man from here to Madras, to Singapore, to Penang, where he got trained, and through the jungles of Burma back to India in a big semicircle. The second is his own journey of transformation from kind of a gung-ho officer who would, if you ask him to take that hill, he'd take that hill and three others, impulsive, driven, to what I would call kind of a reflective and a contemplative soul. And the third journey is India's own tumultuous journey to independence through the Quit India movement and peaceful non-cooperation and so on. So readers can relate to my book in at least three layers. One is kind of evocative landscapes and adventure and intrigue. The second is karma and the human condition, because this journey of his is really a metaphor for life's journey and the twists and turns that life tends to, put in front of all of us. And the third is the geopolitical happenings of World War II and power shifts and so on. And the way I look at it, readers can relate to the book in any of those attributes or a combination of them as they feel comfortable. I don't prescribe. I just put it out there, and they will connect to it in the way they feel appropriate. But that was a very appropriate question. The book is very layered.
Okay. About British subjugation and colonialism, I think all of us have at least a preliminary understanding of it. But the role of other players like the Japanese, that's a part that we have overlooked for a very long time. And you offer like really scathing critique of the Japanese as well. So how did you come to that? What was the research you?
Okay, so if you take a look at the British, and if you take a look at the Japanese, they are two island nations that are resource starved on the sides of a massive continent. So both of them, the way that they had to get those resources in order to develop their countries was to go grab it. The British were just earlier in that process. The British, the French, the Dutch, the Spaniards, they went and grabbed what they could from anywhere in the world. And not only did they take resources, they finished products and sold them back at value-added prices. The Japanese came into it late. But they also did the same thing, because once the US blockaded resources to them, they decided to go grab it. So in a sense, they were both brutal, they were both exploitative, but the British were better at putting a veneer and a polish around it. They are great marketers. The Japanese weren't. The Japanese were very blunt about what they did. And in the end, they lost the war, so they went in a different direction as an American colony. But the fact is this: I think history has proven all the way from Roman times, Greek times, that the powerful will go grab things from other people if those people are not strong. And what do I mean by strong? It's not just military; it's political, economic, and military. And if you are not strong in all of those dimensions, then somebody will come knocking on the door and try to grab what you have. So that's the reason why I wasn't, even though the Japanese were really supporters of the INA and in a sense the good guys, I didn't spare the criticism of their brutality. I mean, they were terrible in terms of what they did to the Chinese particularly. And so, the facts are facts. And so it goes back to the question that you asked. I mean, it's not fictional. I have tried very hard to include as many facts as I can within this veneer of evocative writing.
So what are your resources about this Japanese, the whole training process? Just to confirm, this is a fact that Japanese trained Indian spies,
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
So how did you collect information about these? There is detailed descriptions of this training. Yeah. That's fiction or?
No. A lot of that is real, because I was able to get my hands on documents that talked about what actually happened at this institute and so on. So all of that is factual. In terms of Japanese atrocities in World War II, That's very well documented. I mean, there are many documents that talk about what happened. And of course, there are more documents out there about Japanese atrocities than there are about British atrocities because the British won the war. So, yeah, there are documents that talk about all of that.
And then when it comes to, again, the British, this, um, there is a point where Kumaran Nair is sent to Delhi for, in today's terms, we could use the American phrase, enhanced interrogation techniques. That's the kind of terminology they use for torture. So he is sent, and I'll read this. The Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center. They're animals. Everyone talks there, especially the blacks. Blacks? Okay, let me tell you. You're now at an FIC, a forward interrogation center. We decide if you're a white, gray, or black, depending on how dangerous we think you are. Then the CSDIC in Delhi deals with you. This whole beginning from this, the gory description of the torture, it reminded me of what America did post Iraq in their tortures. So this happened to Indians, our freedom fighters. This is something we rarely talk about.
Yeah, well, let me put it this way. The details of the torture, the actual details of what happens in that chapter, those were based on general research. I don't have, this is back to your point about fiction versus nonfiction. I don't have records that exactly is what happened. Because, when somebody tortures somebody, they don't keep notes, right? But that was the most difficult chapter for me to write because I spent a lot of time researching torture. And it's horrible what people can do to their fellow man. There's only a small percentage of what I researched that ended up in the book. And I'll be honest with you, after doing that research, I couldn't sleep for many days. It was just terrible. So, having said that, it is kind of documented in a general sense that the CSDIC was very brutal in its interrogation. But did they actually do the ABCs of what I write about? No. In fact, I say that in my author notes, that part of it is fictional. But I will tell you that this kind of thing happens. You talked about Abu Ghraib and so on. And here's the interesting thing. During colonial times, a lot of that was done to Indians by Indians. Right? So it just puts things in perspective, I mean, in terms of what colonialism was all about and the kind of lives that people had to lead back then. Very, very different.
So what do you think will be the impact of this book on readers? Do you think they'll go and read more on our freedom struggle? Do you think they'll try to find out, who their ancestors were, how they took part in the freedom of this country?
Well, it goes back to the question that you asked earlier about the layers of the book. It depends on what layer they connect with. They might dig further on that particular vector or this vector. But in terms of broad lessons, at least what I think, is that because the book is really about a journey which is a metaphor for life, I hope people take away from the book that at the end of the day, life's journey may have many twists and turns, but it's really about love and compassion. And the second is, countries and leaders need to make sure their countries are strong and not allow this kind of thing to happen. Because imperial powers will do what imperial powers do. And so those are some takeaways that both ordinary people as well as leaders can take away from the book. But whether they will do that or not, I don't know. It depends on how they connect with the book.
But you hope to?
Yeah.
It's time for us to wind up. So you are a non-resident Malayali. I know it's been some years since you left this place, but we are about to end the session, so why don't you speak a few words in Malayalam? It's okay if the language is broken, but
എൻ്റെ മലയാളത്തിൽ തെറ്റുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ക്ഷമിക്കണം. ഇന്ത്യ വിട്ടിട്ട് 52 കൊല്ലമായി. ആൻഡ് ഈവൻ ബിഫോർ ദാറ്റ് ഞാൻ പഠിച്ചത് വളർന്നതൊക്കെ ഊട്ടിയിലാണ്. സോ അവിടുന്ന് നാട്ടിലേക്ക് വരുമ്പോൾ എല്ലാവരും പറയും തമിഴാണ്, മലയാളമല്ല. സോ നിങ്ങളൊക്കെ വന്നതിന് വളരെ നന്ദി. ഐ ഹോപ്പ് യു ആ ബുക്ക് ഞാൻ ഇത് കഴിഞ്ഞിട്ട് അവിടെ ആ സ്റ്റാൻഡിൽ ഞാൻ ഓഥർ സൈനിങ് ചെയ്യാണ്. നിങ്ങൾ വന്നിട്ട് ഇഫ് യു ബുക്ക് വാങ്ങിയിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ദാറ്റ് വിൽ ബി വെരി നൈസ്. പിന്നെ വേറെ എന്താ പറയുക? താങ്ക് യു വെരി മച്ച്.
thank you everyone.